it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker series presenter, Dr. Merve Balkaya-Ince. She is an applied developmental psychologist whose research centers on the dynamic interplay between context and human development, with a primary focus on the positive development and well-being of children, adolescents, and their families. She is particularly passionate about employing cutting-edge research methods and using advanced data analytic tools to investigate developmental processes at various levels, both within and between individuals, and various timeframes, ranging from a few hours to years. A central focus of her work is uncovering the specific elements and underlying mechanisms through which context shapes human development, moving beyond viewing culture as solely a macro-level influence. Merve is currently an assistant professor of psychology at Wake Forest University. Previously, she served as an assistant research scientist at Baylor University, working with JTF grantee Sarah Schnicker. Along with Madiha Tassin of the Family and Youth Institute of Michigan, Merve led one of our recent Character Through Community grants, which focused on partnering with youth, Muslim religious leaders, and researchers to understand how the virtues of Muslim youth develop across adolescence, how communities foster their virtues, and the mechanisms underlying their development. Please join me in welcoming Merve.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you all for being and having me here today. It's an incredible honor to be here and to present some of my work on faith, community, and character in Muslim American youth. And much of what I will be presenting about today is work that really truly couldn't have been possible without the John Templeton Foundation's generous funding, which I'm incredibly grateful for, especially this early in my career. I want to begin my presentation with this flower on the left, this petunia pushing through concrete, because it truly captures the essence of my work. Much of positive psychology focuses on flourishing and character development, or flowers growing in rich and nurturing soil. But as a developmental and cultural psychologist, I know that not all young people grow up in contexts where the environment is optimal for their flourishing. Many actually face real barriers to their development. And yet some still develop character against the odds, or quite literally through the cracks. And my work examines exactly that. How do Muslim American adolescents draw on their faith and their community to cultivate character even when the context is quite challenging? And that's the story I want to share with you today. And I believe that the story is, yes, on Muslim American adolescents, but it helps you understand really character amidst difficulties across really any specific faith tradition. I'm often asked and sometimes scrutinized for why my work focuses on religion, because there's an anti-religion bias in science, and sometimes even met with, why do you focus on Muslim American adolescents? This feels a little niche and not super important. And I have lots of personal reasons, but I want to tell you about the research reasons. I could have chosen any flower, not this specific petunia, but why does my work focus on Muslim American adolescents? Muslim American youth are members of the fastest growing religious group, both in the United States, but also worldwide. Every 1 out of 4 individuals across the world identifies as Muslim. Yet despite these really growing demographic trends, they remain both underrepresented and misrepresented in research. And to show you what that misrepresentation looks like, I want to tell you a story about Mary and Muhammad, 2 14-year-old American teenagers whose lives are deeply guided by their faith. For Christian youth like Mary, religiosity is commonly seen and also found in research to be a marker of good character. Her faith is perceived as an asset, as a sign of moral grounding and strength. Now let's turn to Muhammad, a Muslim teenager with the same depth of faith commitment. His religiosity often triggers a different public reaction. Instead of being seen as a teenager of good character, he's often seen as a potential threat. The very same religious devotion that was celebrated in Mary is recast as dangerous in Muhammad. And this isn't just a public perception issue, it's reflected in research too. In a review of studies we conducted from 2000 to 2024, we found over 1,400 studies that linked Muslims or Islam to terms like terrorism, radicalization, extremism, and jihad. And only around 50 studies focusing on a plethora of terms describing well being, character, and thriving. In other words, only about 3% of the research on Muslims examine their strengths and flourishing. I want you to imagine if 97% of what we knew about any religious group framed their religion as posing a risk. What assumptions would that create? What stories would we come to believe about who they are and what their religion represents? And this is why studying Muslim American adolescents' faith and their character truly matters and is important. These young people often grow up in contexts where the worst is assumed of them and their religious faith commitments. And our qualitative studies show that. Even though Muslim youth are frustrated with these misconceptions, as you can see in these quotes, they often work harder to cultivate character, seeing themselves as ambassadors of their faith in the face of misunderstandings. And as Sir John Templeton often emphasized, wisdom can be found as long as we're looking with humility. His vision of covenantal pluralism and the free flow of ideas really invites us to learn from any religious groups, not just from straw men, to have really a robust understanding of how religion can guide or cultivate character development. In that same spirit, turning our attention to this very overlooked and often misrepresented community helps us see something that the science on character has largely missed so far. Character can often be cultivated in the face of adversity, and that religion often, in that adverse context, is a strength and as a nurturing factor that helps this petunia grow quite literally through the cracks. Now I'd like to move to some of my work examining how Muslim American adolescents draw on their faith and their community to cultivate their character. And within that realm, I will present primarily findings from two large projects, which are both funded by the John Templeton Foundation. Let's start with the Ramadan ESM study, a study that I designed and led along with the support of my co-investigators, Dr. Madiha Tahsin, Dr. Osman Umarji, and Dr. Sarah Schnitger. And this grant has been funded through the Character Strength Interventions grant led by Sarah Schnitger and Ben Holtberg. What we know about Ramadan is that Ramadan is a month of heightened religiosity and spirituality for Muslim individuals who observe it. Often we think of Ramadan as the month of fasting. That's what most people know, that observing Muslim individuals fast from sunrise to sunset. But it's not just about the fasting behavior. A lot of individuals who observe Ramadan also engage in more religious practices. Youth in particular have often their communities with them, scaffolding them through this time that is quite religious and meaningful to them. When I was growing up, people often assumed that Ramadan is very hard and I would not be excited about it, but they would be often perplexed when I'd be saying, I'm really excited Ramadan is coming up. And that's how it feels for Muslim individuals who observe it. They're very excited for this month, even though it feels difficult to conduct as an outsider perspective. Both within this core team of researchers, as well as with other researchers, we actually have lots of different pieces of evidence that I could present. We also have some student-led papers, which I'm very excited about. This was a graduate student, Karim Karasha, published. Robbie Ritter was an undergraduate / postbac. At the time he published this, Nevaeh Martinez is still an undergraduate student at Baylor. And these are all published studies. What I want to turn my attention to and dive deeper is one of my most favorite studies ever, a set of findings we published in the Journal of Positive Psychology. Let me tell you a little bit more about the study design and why it excites me so much. This study was quite a massive undertaking. We have 5 different steps. So we collected initially survey data from Muslim American adolescents in step 1, which is quite conventional for psychologists to do, that to administer an online survey. This was done before Ramadan. And then we have 3 waves of ESM data, and I'll show you what that looks like in a little bit, where we administer daily surveys multiple times a day for 1 week before Ramadan, 1 week in the month of Ramadan, and 1 week after the month of Ramadan. That's quite intensive for adolescents to participate in that many surveys. And after Ramadan, we conducted another follow-up kind of online survey. For the findings I'll be presenting on today, I will hone in on the step 2, 3, and 4, the ESM survey parts. Here's what the ESM surveys looked like. So adolescents got sent 3 surveys per day for 7 days in total, sent to their phones to take on their phones in the moment. They were prompted, they were asked about things on how they feel right now. They were also asked about things in the last hour, on their patience and gratitude and other things, compassion. And they were asked questions about how they were feeling across the day overall. And then the Ramadan survey sample, it's important that one was really early afternoon or midday fasting. In the late evening, the survey 2 was right before fast breaking. This is the most exhausted time that an outsider would think about, because you're depleted, you're hungry, you're exhausted. And survey 3 was at the end of the day after breaking fast. The research question that we examined here was, do Muslim American adolescents become more virtuous during Ramadan? And we really focused on their self-control, their patience, and their compassion in this study. And these findings are really exciting for 2 reasons. Often when we study religion, it's not easy to manipulate that. You can't very easily make a person more religious than they usually are. It's very difficult to have experimental control over levels of religiosity. So most things we know and how religion is linked to character is really correlational, aka you have 2 different individuals, one is higher in religiosity, one is lower in religiosity, and this individual here tends to do better and has more patience, self-control, and gratitude than this other person. And you infer that this is about their religiosity. We don't know. Maybe more virtuous individuals tend to be more compliant or more compatible with religious beliefs. We don't know that. What excites me about Ramadan is that we don't have to manipulate people. People are already becoming more religious. So we can use that as a very nice way of using a naturalistic intervention. And that's what we exactly did. And I want you to think with me here through the results, and I'll have you play researcher a little bit here with me. So inhibitory self-control is a type of self-control that is about resisting an urge. So you're tempted to do something that you're not supposed to do. Are you resisting your urges better before, during, or after Ramadan? What do you think? Hands up if you think youth are resisting urges better before and after Ramadan. Hands up if you, okay, I see one hand. Hands up if you think youth are resisting urges better during Ramadan. Okay, that's the majority of you. Do you think it stays high after Ramadan or goes back? What do you think? It stays higher, okay. That would work with the muscle metaphor that researchers often think about. Here's what psychologists were thinking before we set up the study, and here's what we hypothesized. Often self-control is thought as a muscle. If you flex it and flex it and flex it, you're so depleted that you don't have any more to give. So in Ramadan, with that flexing of the self-control muscle, we thought maybe energies would be depleted and they couldn't do it as highly, or at least this is Western psychology really doing these hypotheses for us. But even if you flex that muscle and are exhausted in the moment, you've ultimately kind of strengthened your muscle. So after Ramadan, we did expect an increase in youth's resisting of urges. Here's what we found. And these are levels within individuals. So this is, let's say, Muhammad compared to Muhammad's own levels before and after Ramadan, which is really important to point out. So youth tended to be lower before Ramadan, high during Ramadan, but then they went back to pre-Ramadan levels after Ramadan. And we think that youth may be potentially needing these extra scaffolding sources to resist their urges during Ramadan because they had much more community support to resist their urges. They had way more scaffolding, they had more community, they had more reminders throughout the day that helped them stay on track with their goals. What about initiatory control? This is the type of self-control that where you do something even though in the moment you don't feel like doing it. Do people feel it's higher before Ramadan? Higher during Ramadan? Who thinks it stays high after Ramadan? A couple. This is what we found. The muscle metaphor worked. You're great researchers. Thanks for entertaining this with me. So youth were truly getting better at initiating something even when they didn't feel like doing it in the moment, and they stayed stronger even after Ramadan. So whatever they were doing in terms of heightened religious practices, they knew they now could do it. They trusted their kind of own willpower and discipline to do it. What about patience? Higher during Ramadan? Who thinks it stays high during Ramadan? After Ramadan. Here's what we found. Very similar to initiatory self-control, these are findings we replicate across very different sets of data. That patience seems to be more similar to initiatory self-control than inhibiting an urge, which is telling you a lot about the action-oriented nature of patience. Often people assume patience is very this passive waiting. It's really not. There's a goal orientation and an initiation aspect of patience that lay people often forget about. What about compassion? Think about people who are not doing as well as you are. Higher during Ramadan? Stays high after Ramadan? Here's something that surprised us. It actually started high before Ramadan, it stayed high during Ramadan, and it went back to lower levels after Ramadan. I think part of this was our study design. This first wave of pre-Ramadan, we collected a week before Ramadan when people are already talking. Parents are already telling, we're going to fast and we're going to think about the poor and this is how it's going to make us feel and things like that. There's a lot of also messages or donation kind of prompts that youth get on their cell phones because of the algorithms of donate money during Ramadan. So there was, I think, already an activation starting before Ramadan. And the post-Ramadan might be either there's not opportunities we give youth to feel compassionate after Ramadan, where we prompt them to think about people who are not doing as well, or maybe compassion, we were also thinking there's a compassion fatigue. Maybe you're thinking about people who are suffering, but maybe at one point you have to protect yourself. So overall, what these sets of findings showed us is similar to what the research was saying. If you have two different teenagers, one, let's assume this is stereotypically is more religious and the other is less religious, that the teenager who was more religious also tended to be higher on character. What is even more exciting is when you look at the same teenager. Let's say this is Anas. Anas has moments where he's not feeling super religious. He's more secular, thinking about real world things, maybe not as much about his religiosity. But then he has moments where he feels about his religiosity and thinks more deeply about his faith commitment. In these situations, he's doing better than he usually does. He's more patient, he's more compassionate. There's other studies we have done with collaborators who really show this with in-person increase in addition to the findings I just showed you. So despite these public conceptions of religion being a threat to Muslim American adolescents, our studies really refute kind of that misconception and show within and across youth, religion seems to be a strength of asset similar to those in Mary. Now I want you to transition to two sets of finding from the Building Blocks of Tarbiyah study, a community-based project. We've relabeled this project as the Building Blocks of Tarbiyah study, and for different reasons. Tarbiyah is an Arabic term that linguistically means to increase, nurture, or socialize, but often it is used in the context of character or like this good socialization aspect of youth. And the overarching goal of the study was to understand with the community and for the community how religious communities play a role in cultivating character among Muslim American youth. And as Alex has introduced this study, this has been a study we led together with Dr. Madiha Tahsin from the Family and Youth Institute. And you see really 4 puzzle pieces or 2 sides of this puzzle. On the left-hand side, you see aspects of this grant that are really community-based. On the right hand side, there you go, of this puzzle, you see the research aspects of this grant. And although they seem separate, they really go hand in hand. And I want to show you some pictures of what the community aspects look like before I dive into specifics in terms of the research findings. These pictures are from one of our community activities where we brought together this community of practice, or AKA researchers, practitioners who work with youth in real setting, who have the shared goal of really cultivating character within religious community settings among Muslim American youth. So we gathered a group of practitioners and shared what the existing research so far says. The Let's Play researcher activity I did with you, I had them do too, and they were very excited about playing researcher. They had really good ideas too. But rather than just us talking to them, we really recognize the immense value they bring to the table. They're the experts interacting with these youth on a daily basis, sometimes for more than a decade. So we wanted to hear really from them. Together, we designed activities where we asked them, what does character development look like? What are the things that we conceptualize in a kind of psychology framework, often Western-based? How do they look like in the lived experiences of these youth? Are the constructs even applicable? Do we have to change the measures? And things like that really get into the nitty-gritty of doing good science. Because you could adapt and copy paste the measure into a new population, but my cultural insider perspective or my cultural psychologist perspective knows that's wrong. Then you're comparing apples and oranges, and it's really not good science anymore. But what's even more important is that we truly build a community together. We bonded across age groups, race, ethnicity, levels of religiosity, even different faith traditions, and geographical locations. We did this over bonfires, communal prayers, really lunches together. It was incredibly meaningful for me to do this kind of research this early in my career too. This is an incredible kind of honor to have been able to do this. It's like a researcher's dream come true that you connect with the communities that you do research with. And whenever you have a research question, I can just text them in a WhatsApp group and be like, I found these findings that I don't know how to interpret. Can you help me make meaning of them? This is how close we got. There are actually some of these community practitioners are now helping us with other grants and are being experts in the community on a parenting study on patients. And before I move into some specific research questions, I really want to show you what the value of this community-based research is, because you put in so much money into this project. So I want to show you why it's so valuable beyond just me texting community practitioners in a WhatsApp group. So this is a quite massive undertaking in terms of time commitment. We conducted a longitudinal research study over 5 different time points. Anyone who's worked with adolescents know they don't love long things to do and long commitments, but they stayed quite engaged. I also want to preface with, this was an incredibly difficult time period for them historically and sociopolitically. So it was already stressed times where we actually did really well, I feel like, with retention rates, and they were really deeply committed in staying in the study. Not to brag, but we collected data from 661 Muslim American youth. They were quite diverse. This is the most diverse study on Muslim American youth that I've ever seen. It is more diverse than any other study I could have collected data on, which is really good, because you want, when you publish on Muslim American youth, you want the findings to be generalizable, not only to youth who are geographically in the same location that you do the study with, and or from the ethnic backgrounds that you've been able to get your hands on. we got data from youth from 41 different states. If I did this just by myself, I would get maybe 3, maybe 4, but that's it. This is not thanks to just the funding. This is really through the community lens. They went out there. They publicized the study. They built trust for us. These youth don't know me. Their parents don't know me. Why would they trust me in trying to do good for them or with them? So this was immense kind of in terms of good science and generalizability of findings. There was another aspect that was also really good and humbled me as a researcher. Often we come in as researchers say, I think these are the things that are going to be very important in terms of character and virtues for Muslim American youth. We bring in our researcher lens and our research expertise, which is valuable. But then you hear from the community practitioners and they're like, you missed something. This was actually in the very first town hall where we tried to bond a little bit before we had the in-person convening and feel people out and just get to connect with them a little bit before we saw these most often unfamiliar faces in person, where one of the community practitioners said, you're missing something that is incredibly important, courage. And they didn't just tell us this, and were very blunt and open and very willing and generous to share their expertise. They also sang songs about this, which I want to have you listen for a second.
A job again, my pick in my village, and I would never been. I am not afraid to stand alone. I am not afraid to stand alone. If it lies by my side, I am not afraid to stand alone. Everything you be, I am not afraid to stand alone. I'm not afraid to stand alone. If it lies by my side, everything.
So this wasn't just a floating experience or floating suggestion. This has been so salient that they had lyrics and songs about this. But we as researchers never focused on religious courage, not outside of the Muslim American community, nowhere. There's not a study on religious courage anywhere else. And interestingly, even in psychology, there's very little work on courage as a construct in general. And often, unfortunately, it's very fear-based. It's not the moral courage of living up to who you are, despite pressures not to be who you are. So this is not a construct that is only kind of singled out for the Muslim American community. This is a construct I would suggest and really think is really important in the lives of many, many different teenagers, regardless of which faith tradition they come from. And we developed a measure on religious courage. We tested it longitudinally. It worked really well. And it was tremendous in terms of output. We're actually now moving into the religious courage and the moral courage literature, even beyond the Muslim American group, to really get deeper into this construct that has been so neglected. And we had a blind spot for it too, without the community practitioners really help in guiding us there. Now I want to really focus on 2 snapshots of findings. One, I want to focus on Muslim youth's character development amidst difficulties. I mentioned this was a difficult time for them, but did they grow despite being really challenged in this kind of difficult time? Is one question. And then the second question on what role does religious communities play? So let's focus on the first one. Do patience, self-control, and gratitude grow despite these difficulties? And do they co-develop? Often people think that maybe character or virtues are a package deal. When you grow in one, the others probably will grow with it. Let's see what happens. We found that patience and self-control grow, but gratitude seems pretty stable across time points, which is interesting. Again, the conjunction between patience and self-control and how much they overlap here is very interesting. One thing that I do want to talk, we have some qualitative open-ended response questions. This is not interviews, but response in surveys, where youth actually talked about gratitude growing, but their levels of reference for gratitude change, which we can't capture in the gratitude survey. So the are you more grateful than usual kind of questions don't get that level, but our they did talk about now feeling more grateful even for the most littlest things in their lives, like having a house over their head and having food at their disposal and things like that. So I think now they maybe saw themselves, they raised their bar for themselves in terms of what gratitude means potentially in this difficult time. We also found that youth high in one of the virtues at the beginning of this study tended to be high on the others as well. There is some support for this package deal. Youth on the contrary who were low tended to be low on the others too as well. And if youth grow in one of these virtues, they also more likely grow in the others. So if you see some growth, which could be attributed to potentially they have more socialization experiences, or maybe their religious communities are helping them, or maybe they're making meaning out of this new contextual kind of stressors they have in their lives, they tend to also grow in the other. What is interesting to me as a psychologist is that youth who were high in patience at the beginning of the study had less room to grow in self-control, versus those who started lower in patience had more room to grow, which is sometimes a little complex and difficult to understand, but it just means if you're already low, maybe you have this much even room to grow. There's going to be a kind of ceiling, at least in the measures that we use. But if you start on a 3, you can come up to a 5-point level in the survey. So what's the takeaway on this set of findings? Muslim American adolescents develop character even in times of tremendous adversity and struggle. Now I want to phone in on the role that religious communities play. We talked about religion being good for Muslim American youth, both within and across youth. But are all religious youth really truly the same? There's a lot of within group diversity in any kind of group. This is a study led by Karim Karasha, a Ph.D. student at Baylor University, and he said, why don't we always compare behavioral engagement? What about motivations of engaging in religion? And I'm going to show you or do a very quick snapshot of the findings, which are way more complicated than what I'll kind of show. But think of 2 teenagers, the one on the left who engages highly in religion. The one on the right also highly engages in religion. He practices 5 times prayers a day. But let's assume the one on the left does it for intrinsic reasons. He finds value and meaning in the religious practice. It makes him feel stronger. It is consistent with his beliefs and with his kind of what is important in his life and his identity. Let's assume the one on the right does it because his parents and community are pressuring him to. Or people are staring, why don't you pray when everyone else does? Things. They're both very highly engaged. Our findings also show that these 2 profiles of youth have had higher sense of belonging at time 1. So greater sense of belonging in both of these youth, high levels of engagement across both of these youth. But only the teenager on the left fares better than the other one. So this teenager actually has higher levels of self-control, patience and gratitude, has lower levels of anxious and depressive symptoms than this teenager and 2 other profiles of teenagers who are engaging less and either not motivated at all to engage in religion or engaging less but feeling control to engage in religion. So what's the take home? Our collective research really has shown that religion, despite being depicted as this picture, religion is good for Muhammad and Muslim youth like him, and that he really looks more like Mary, where religion should be celebrated for his character development. But what are we doing with this and where are we going from here? So yes, we're publishing these findings, but what's important for me is that we're not doing research on the community for better science. What is important to me is that we do research with the community, for the community, which ultimately has a ripple effect for better science. It's just kind of a side effect. So findings that I've presented so far, we have shared in podcasts, giving it back to the community. This has been primarily led by the Family and Youth Institute. We also, in terms of this community-based grant, we're actually going full circle here. So we started with the community, got their input. We now did the longitudinal study, have some findings to share. In the very last convening, I actually asked them, what are your research questions? I have tons of data. I might not be interested or able to publish all of them. Some of the very ingrained community questions, there might not be outlets, journal outlets that are really interested in that kind of question, but what are you interested in? And I really had them play and come up with research questions that I now want to share back in a webinar. And we promised them a series of webinars where we do exactly that. And as we get more research findings, whether these are published findings that we examine or their research interests, we're really giving it back to the community and informing them. Also, as part of this output, as an output of the grant, we developed a toolkit that is now tested in communities that help them understand what communities can do to develop good character among youth. And in terms of my future directions, I have kind of 3 different lines of where I want to go with this. So we are currently collaborating on a study on patience in times of adversity. This is a larger Templeton Religion Trust funded grant led by Sarah Schnitger, but this is really across many different kind of institutions. And we're interested in what do parents do when they raise teenagers, and raising teenagers is really hard because they're not as cute anymore. And sometimes they'll tell you things like they hate you. So it can be difficult. But what do parents do in times of adversity and in difficult circumstances to raise teenagers and be patient and grow through that experience? And I'm the Muslim American population expert, so I'm going to collect data on Muslim American adolescent parents and their with adolescent kids. But we also have 3 other teams. So these questions are really applicable to any other population too. We have a group of parents who have transition age kids with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We also have a population of lower SES from Southern California. So these questions don't only apply to Muslim American adolescents. I do want to go way more deeper on the moral courage literature because it excites me as a developmental psychologist. There's a lot of notion on risk-taking among adolescents. Courage is a form of risk and withstanding pressure. That is kind of good. You want that in your teenager. But it's really not talked in this positive way in research, the way that we really want to push forward. I'm also a co-investigator in a Templeton Religion Trust grant on covenantal pluralism that my colleague Aranda Jaya-Vikrame at Wake Forest University is leading, where we're trying to get really more into what does it take to engage peacefully across religious differences and learn from one another. And really in the long term, my goal is to do more dynamic and dyadic socialization of character. How can we, with different kind of agents having a play at nurturing our youth, help them to develop these most optimal circumstances as much as we can with what we are given. I do want to thank the Muslim American community for really being so generous with me in terms of sharing their expertise, their trust, and their willingness to participate. My mentors and colleagues for really helping me through all of this. My research assistants who've been really an integral part of any kind of data collection, our institutional partners, and the John Templeton Foundation for your generous funding.